Welcome to this panel event this evening. Great to see so many of you here. I'm Miranda Nunhofer and I represent SAGE this evening, and we are thrilled to be co-hosting this event with Sense About Science as part of the ESRC Festival of the Social Sciences. Our theme tonight is making sense of the social sciences, and we at SAGE are particularly pleased to be supporting this event and also to be part of the ESRC Festival of the Social Sciences. SAGE is heading into its 50th year next year. We were founded in 1965 as a social science publisher, and Sarah Miller McEwen, our founder, who is still very active in the organisation, has always been passionate about supporting the social sciences. Obviously, as a publisher, our main way of supporting it has been through publishing journals, books, new online products, and disseminating high-quality research and pedagogical tools. Increasingly, we've started to also look to support some of the activities around sort of advocacy and the social sciences, and really supporting social science research as an important part of making our societies a healthier place, and supporting the influence of social science research on policy and evidence-based policy making. And so it's been particularly exciting to work with the ESRC on this series of events that they've been doing over the last few years as part of the Social Science Festival. Tonight we have a great panel here, which Pratik will introduce in a minute, and it's really fantastic to have people from the media, academic research, and also policy. And we will be looking at the ways that we can make social science make sense to the public. How does the public understand the research that they're reading? How do they understand the quality of that research, what its foundations are, and what the role of the different tools are, like peer review in particular, and how that can influence the way that people can perceive whether the validation of that science and the social sciences. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pratik from Sense About Science, who will introduce the panel. And we look forward to lots of lively debate this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miranda. For those who don't know, my name's Pratik Butch, and I'm from Sense About Science, a charity that helps put science and evidence in the hands of the public. And in doing that work, our office team, half of which is here tonight, which gives you an idea of the scale of our operation, we often wonder, I don't know what to believe when I'm reading the media, when I'm listening to the Today programme, when I'm listening to claims that politicians make or that I might see on through the press. And so it's really great to be here today at the ESRC Science Festival in partnership with SAGE to take on this really interesting topic and to discuss it tonight. We've got a fantastic panel. Let's move straight into our contributions for tonight. I'm going to ask Jonathan Brecken to speak first from the Alliance for Useful Evidence.
Thank you, Pratik. The point I really want to stress when answering this question of what to believe, what you can trust, is an issue of replication, of repeating things. It's not a very glamorous area of social science and science generally, but desperately important that we don't just trust one individual study that gets that brilliant piece of media coverage or gets the ear of the minister, but that we see something in the whole. I think it's a very unglamorous area of things like synthesizing research, but desperately important. People bring things all together, whether it's in big meta-analysis, systematic reviews, or other ways. The ESRC has shown really gutsy leadership in setting up 6, possibly up to 9 work centres, which are research centres bringing together the best available research in social policy. It's happened before. We talked about something about 10 years ago where what work centres happened before, but this is a really great chance to bring together a whole range of research for key challenges out there. But there is a crisis out there in science, I think. And there was a great piece, I don't know if you've seen it, in The Economist last year. Has anyone seen this? There was a feature called How Science Goes Wrong. And what was really interesting was the response to this editorial, where although the focus was on science, it did stray into areas like psychology and social psychology and areas of social science. There's been areas, high-profile areas of fraud in some academic research overseas. There has been some areas where people have done some dodgy statistics. I wouldn't call it fraud. There has been some areas where you've seen the so-called herding instinct, where the peer review process hasn't always worked, and people have all come around to agree a good piece of research actually was rather iffy. What Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, psychologist, nudge agitator, has called for is a daisy chain of replication in some areas, particularly an area of social psychology, priming, where there's been this crisis of not replicating really key landmark research studies that haven't been repeated, that have got the media interest, that have got big funding and so forth overseas. But we need to constantly repeat these studies, synthesize it, bring it all together. And I feel that is a critical way to get from those dangerous pieces of research that get that interest but actually fall through when looking at further analysis. I think there's also a really important issue about research being appropriate to your question. How we get that message across is difficult. I'm working with another network called BOND, which works in international development. They have a brilliant way of looking at the appropriateness of evaluation. So we don't come along with one type of research, one type of method, and say that's the answer to everything. We actually think of the challenge and then see what the method might be to answer that, and hopefully a mixed method that will go to answer that question, that challenge. Some people have looked at hierarchies of evidence. There are formal hierarchies, big in the US. There's a big misunderstanding in the UK that people like NICE, National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, Care Excellence, use that kind of hierarchy of evidence. They don't, they've dropped that. But an idea that you have different types of evidence matched to your problem. Very controversial, but it's still a way of thinking about not all evidence is the same. We need to think about appropriateness. And finally, peer review. Peer review is important, but to paraphrase Churchill, peer review is probably the worst way of judging research, except for all the others. It is, I think, a really useful way of doing things. There is lots of evidence, and there's been great articles in Nature recently about some studies showing the flaws in peer review, that unconscious or conscious, whether it's about publication bias or that issue of herding, lots of areas where it's dodgy, but it's still probably the gold standard we have. And what we're doing in the run-up to the general election with the Conversation UK, a big website funded by universities across the UK and many other funders like Wellcome, Nuffield and so forth, is vetting some of the claims made by politicians in the run-up to the election in manifestos, but using academics to check those claims, and interestingly using peer review, but a blind peer review. So people don't know necessarily what the other academic has said about their comments on this vetting of some of these claims made around the manifestos and election. Look out for that, because I think it's going to be really interesting. It's a bit of a test, bit of an experiment, but I think it could be really, really important, as long as we don't judge one individual academic's view on what's said out there, but look at the whole range. That's my 5 minutes.
I usually have the pleasure of thanking speakers for sticking to time. Jonathan, you finished early, which gives us even more time to pick up some interesting comments. I'm really interested in particular in this issue of whether the way you've tried to answer a question is appropriate to the problem you're trying to tackle, and how that relates to the trustworthiness of research. I'm sure that's something I hope that's something we can pick up in the Q&A. I want to introduce next Aileen Murphy from the National Audit Office.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to Sage and the ESRC for asking me along, and that's not just because when you work for the National Audit Office you don't get out much. But oh dear, usually that gets a bigger laugh than that. They were a tough crowd, yes, absolutely. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about why social science research is important, both in government and also for people like me that look at what government does and tries to work out what exactly we've got for our money. And why is it so important? Well, because it all relates to the way in which governments develop public policy. And public policy is really important before anyone starts nodding off, because that's what the government attaches billions and billions of pounds of public money to. Anybody get any idea how much government spent last year in its entirety? Hands up.
Including debt? No, sorry.
Don't get techy. It's £700 billion. Now, that's a lot of money, isn't it? As Timothy Geithner once said, you've got a billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about serious money. So the important point is that government ought to spend our money on things that actually have the effect that they thought they wanted to have when they started out. And what I do in my job as a VFM auditor, and I have done for the last 30 years, and I'm not getting on a bit, I'm just started when I was 10, that's why I look this old, is to report to Parliament on what value for money government has actually got for it. It's not a job that makes you particularly popular, but it does keep you entertained. So a key aspect of it is what government wants us to do. What it wants us to do is really difficult things. It wants us to stop behaving in the way we want to behave. It doesn't want us to smoke, it doesn't want us to drink, it doesn't want us to commit criminal offences, and it generally wants us to do everything online because it's really, really cheap compared with turning up to the post office with your documents and getting your car taxed that way. So trying to get people to behave in different ways is a really complex thing, and it's only through things like social science research about how people actually behave and how you can alter the behaviour that you can really work out how to get them to change. So, and the VFM analysis that we do depends on there being robust evidence of what works in terms of interventions that governments do. And what I've found over the last 30 years is that, for the most part, government policy is based on opinion, intuition and guesswork, and there really is very little evidence about what really works in some very important areas. I don't want to bang on, and he's got this app here that's got the time, so I'm actually trying not to stare at it, but I'll give you a couple of examples. I did a report on the management of short sentence prisoners. Now, those are prisoners who serve a sentence of less than a year, and there are 60,000 people in the UK every year who get a short sentence. That can be anything from a few weeks to 11 and a half months. Most serve less than 6 weeks. It costs £286 million, and on the upside, for the majority of them, they're kept safe in prison. Their most pressing needs are attended to, mostly medical. They get taken care of for that short period of time, and then they go back out again. But no one evaluates what interventions they get in prison. Nobody actually collects what interventions they get in prison, like housing advice or employment advice or whatever, or advice on addiction. No one traces them afterwards, and they have a 60% chance of reconviction. And I think for £286 million, we can do a great deal better than that. So therefore, we need evidence to create cost-effective responses and combinations of responses for different people in different situations. My second example is on the Help to Buy equity loan scheme. Anybody heard of that? It's fantastic, isn't it? You find a new built house, right, that you want to buy, you come up with a 5% deposit and the government will give you 20% of the purchase price. Brilliant, isn't it? You don't have to pay anything back for 5 years, all you got to pay is a fee. So the question with the Help to Buy scheme is why more people don't apply, to be honest. But it's intended to do a number of things. The first one is to ease access to mortgage finance. Well, it certainly does that when you look at how popular it's been. But one of the more important things is about attending to one of the failures in the housing market, which is the lack of supply. That gets much more difficult. How does increasing access to mortgage finance exactly work, causally speaking, in increasing the supply of houses? That's a rhetorical pause, because actually we don't know. We don't know how it's going to be measured. The department doesn't measure it. We don't know what the linking chain of causality is from that intervention to the effect that they wanted to create. And what if those houses were going to be built anyway? We've no idea what the size of a deadweight is. So regardless of the fact there's no evidence, there's no plan for evaluation, the original amount of £3.7 billion was up to 10 in the last budget. So we're going to have another £10 billion worth spent on the Help to Buy equity loan scheme. And I'm not just being mean to DCLG and picking that out, but what I'm saying is that it goes back to a fundamental failure of government about causality and attribution and actually monitoring what it is that you've achieved. So basically, sometimes government does things in the hope that things will be better rather than anything else. But there's another couple of questions I want to explore in the next 32 seconds. The next question is about what gets researched. Quite often the things that I think are really important and that are big gaps, and believe me, nobody asks me about it, don't get researched. I mean, one of the things we looked at last year was on the management of the prison estate. The prison estate is getting bigger. There are bigger individual prison establishments. We're getting rid of small ones, out-of-the-way ones in the country. So that means the whole estate is changing its character. Now, there is no evidence that links the physical conditions in which people are held with whether or not they reoffend afterwards. We don't know, actually, whether bigger prisons are harder to manage in terms of sort of operational type research. So there's an awful lot that we don't know, and I don't see anywhere in government where people are sitting back and saying, what are the most important questions that we don't know about, and what should we be researching? Last but not least, where was I getting on to? So there's a need to focus research on what we don't know to reduce uncertainty in policy making, because uncertainty makes, funnily enough, departmental officials sound more certain when they produce a white paper and proposals than if they really had some evidence. Because whenever you see something that sounds really bullish, you can bet your sweet bippy that they don't actually know that what they're saying is what's going to work. Though I hate to be cynical about it. And then the question arises, if you do actually look at what works, you'll then find out what doesn't work and what government has to stop doing because it's ineffective. That's a really difficult thing politically for people. If you look at the whole area of adult social care, you get people who are assessed at one point, they get a certain package of care, no one looks at it again for 5 years. Do they still need that package of care, or should we take that money off and put it somewhere else? Very difficult to do, to say to somebody, well, we have been sending you somebody 3 days a week, but actually you're better now and you can't have it. So it's very tricky, and with bigger things where we've got even less evidence, like what happens in prisons, it gets very difficult indeed. So I think that's where peer review can help, because it gives departmental officials a feeling that whatever it is that they've come up with and has been tested out there has actually been looked at by more than one set of eyes. Because departments get very fond of their favourite academics, so there's a bit of a risk. If they keep going to the same people, they'll get the same answers. And replication, I think, is a very important, very neglected concept. But what I tend to see in government is the fact of not evaluating your outcomes. That's replicated. And we know that doesn't work. So we could stop doing that, couldn't we? Last but not least, where was I? So double-sided printing is a nightmare for me, because I can never find where I'm supposed to be. So I think social science in itself is critically important to the full evaluation of policy. I think it's at its best when it's broadly, soundly evidence-based, and there's a feedback loop between what's been found out and how it feeds through into policy. I think it should be central to policy making and not just done on the edge, and I think it should be organised in a cross-government way on a long-term and soundly funded basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aileen. And there's a huge amount there for us to pick up on the discussion afterwards. I think in particular how on earth we get government departments to put evidence into the picture, especially on things that we don't actually know anything about. That's a critical question I think we should be asking more frequently. Let's turn now to our next speaker, Mike Hume from King's College London.
Thank you. So I'm wanting to make a few remarks about peer review as it is currently practiced, and some of the tensions and pressures that are on the academic peer review system. And that leads me to a second set of remarks that I want to make about the idea of extended peer review, which has an inheritance from the idea of post-normal science. And why there are some, in my view at least, some very good reasons, given the contemporary moment that we are living in, that we should pay a lot more attention to this idea of extended peer review. I'm also interested in what we make of the difference between trustworthy science, trustworthy social science, and trustworthy humanities or human knowledge. And that's something personally that I'm very interested in, having worked in the whole area of climate change for an awful long time, and recognising that there are different knowledges that are relevant for understanding climate change and the options for humanity to deal with it. And yet there tends to be an assumption that it is only one certain type of knowledge that actually is most pertinent. But just to start off with some of the pressures that are on the academy and the conventional system of peer review as it is currently practiced, there is a huge explosion of academic journals that will all claim to be peer review journals. This has happened gradually over the 20th century, but exponentially increased over the last 10 years. Even the last 5 years, as more and more publishers, publishing ventures move into peer-reviewed academic journals, on the back of the notion of open access. And what this has done, it means that the whole volume of requests for academics to undertake peer review has increased exponentially. I know this as an editor of an international peer review journal, trying to get reviewers to review manuscripts. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to persuade reviewers at least who I judge are competent reviewers, to undertake that role. So the system is under extreme pressure, and part of this pressure is due to this open access movement and the proliferation of journals. And it becomes increasingly difficult to apply a common set of norms and ethical practices across this proliferation of open access journals. Linked to open access, a very interesting point it seems to me, if the idea of open access journals is that all knowledge that is published through peer review should be open to the public to read. It shouldn't be behind paywalls. Anyone should get access to this published knowledge. A corollary of that, it seems to me, if we're asking for open access to public knowledge, should we not also be thinking about open review, open peer review? In other words, rather than just getting 2 or sometimes 3 experts to adjudicate whether a paper is credible or not, one actually opens up that entire process to anybody who wants to make a comment and a remark on the credibility of that paper or not. So open access of knowledge suggests to me there's an argument for open access of review. The third pressure seems to me that academic publishing and the idea of peer review is under is the very nature of the academy. More and more academics and scientists are finding their own performance by their managers is increasingly reduced to a series of performance metrics. And this particularly applies around bibliometrics. How many papers you publish, how many times they get cited, are those papers published in the most prestigious journals? And academic performance is being distorted because of these performance metrics. And that's leading to some of the examples that we heard of earlier about some scandals in some areas of science and social science, it seems to me. So, peer review as it currently is practiced, I don't think is sustainable in the academy. And so that's why I think we should pay more attention to this idea of extended peer review. The idea of extended peer review came out of an argument that Jerry Revets and Silvio Funtovic made about 20 years ago, that increasingly issues of research in the academy deal with issues that they call post-normal. Issues which are, in their view, where values are in dispute, where facts are uncertain, where decisions are urgent, and where stakes are high. This is not ivory tower knowledge. This is knowledge that actually circulates and engages with all social, political, and public actors. And their argument is that if that is the sort of knowledge and research that is being produced, then it is incumbent on that process to open up that process of peer review to these social and public actors. It cannot be conducted behind closed doors in secluded settings. And we should find new ways of engaging social and public actors in accrediting research and knowledge. And of course, that idea that they started playing with around 20 years ago has become increasingly prevalent or increasingly pertinent as we see new internet and social media technologies that open up the possibility for new forms of extended peer review. And we know, too, the number of issues in public life that would classify as post-normal, values in dispute, facts uncertain, decisions urgent, stakes are high, have also expanded. And climate change, the field that I work in, is perhaps an exemplar of that nature of knowledge. And so it seems to me that we should therefore be seeking new ways of opening up and extending this peer review process. If knowledge is going to be valuable, it's going to be trusted, it's going to have salience in public debates, then it should be subject to these processes. The final point, which is really a question I would be interested to get some answers to. How do people judge the difference between scientific knowledge, social scientific knowledge, and knowledge that comes out of humanities, out of literary criticism, out of ethics, out of philosophy, out of creative art? That knowledge, it seems to me, is just as important and powerful in public life, dealing with these post-normal issues. And how do we accredit and find that sort of humanities knowledge or scholarship trustworthy or not? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. A real challenge there to everyone involved in social science and research in general as to whether the processes we have in place for peer review are fit for purpose or not. And something that's given us a lot of food for thought. I'm going to turn to our second Mike of the evening. Mike Hanlon, freelance science writer. All yours, Mike.
Good evening, everybody. First, I'd like to thank the panel for saving me some extra minutes, stealing some of my best jokes. Peer review being the worst possible way of evaluating whether something is proper science or not, apart from all the others. I think it's a very valid point. One of the things, I'm just going to fire off sort of brainstorm of things coming from a media perspective here, because it's my job, it's been my job for 20 years to cover science, controversies in science. Things don't get in the papers unless they're controversial. One of the other things that's come up is we talk a lot about peer review. We don't talk so much about replication. When you study science at school, one of the first things you're told is scientists publish things in academic journals so other scientists can go away and do the same experiments again and show that they were indeed valid and true. It came as something of a shock to me to realise that a tiny fraction of 1% of any of these studies are usually anyone actually does this. So that's something to bear in mind. I thought I would concentrate on two recent, really modish debates to talk a little bit about how evidence, quality of evidence and non-evidence is used both in the media and by policymakers. One is drugs. There's been quite a lot of hoo-ha in the last couple of weeks in Britain about whether we should decriminalise or legalise, what phrase we decide to use, the use of certain drugs. We have one state in the United States has recently decriminalised the use of marijuana, and I believe Oregon, and that was Colorado, Oregon and Alaska have followed suit. The other thing I want to talk about is climate change and how we communicate the story of climate change. I think drugs is an interesting one. My personal view is that I'm broadly sympathetic to the argument that criminalising all drug users has not been effective. The war on drugs has been a failure. However, I think the insistence that the debate about narcotics should be framed in purely scientific terms. Do these things do more harm than other substances? Does banning drugs actually work? Isn't entirely valid. It's not an entirely scientific question. A friend of mine, Peter Hitchens, who's a columnist on the Mail on Sunday, I disagree with almost everything Peter Hitchens believes in, but he is a very, very good arguer, very nice chap. And Peter Hitchens basically thinks it is morally wrong to get off your head on narcotic substances. He would argue that even if it could be shown that other substances like alcohol or cigarettes were far more harmful. And I think it's useful when we're talking about some of these debates that impinge on moral norms to separate the scientific evidence from the moral evidence or the moral views, and take into account that some people think that some things are right or wrong regardless of evidence. And an awful lot of evidence-based policy is obviously policy-based evidence, but rather than pretending it's always a scientific question, sometimes we have to just accept that it isn't. If you look at the history of policy on drugs, it shows this very well. 100 years ago, most currently illegal drugs were perfectly legal in Britain and the rest of Europe and North America. Heroin is actually a trademark. Heroin makes you heroic, and it was marketed and sold mostly to young women until the early years of the 20th century. Marijuana wasn't criminalized until the 30s. Cocaine was completely legal for most of the 20th century in the United States. So the moral and political reaction to drugs is not a scientific one. But I think people using the argument that we need to use science to inform this debate should take into account the non-scientific views. The other thing to talk about with certainty and evidence, I think climate change illustrates it very well. The climate change has been a story now for about 26 years. It came as a shock for me to realise the other day when I was writing about it that the IPCC is actually 26 years old. I mean, it still feels to me like a relatively new thing, but it's been going a long time. Clearly, whatever it is we're doing and all this talking isn't having any effect whatsoever, because carbon emissions are still going up. I think from the media's perspective, it's a classic example of where two words create a huge set of problems: uncertainty and doubt. Now, uncertainty means something different to doubt, but I think the media equates the two. When you listen to the Today programme, and again, John Humphreys is a great bloke, I know him, and he's a lovely man, but he will say, so you're not certain. So there is doubt over the whole climate change or GM or whatever it is agenda. Uncertainty is a perfectly good thing. It's very good to be uncertain about something. Being certain about something usually means you're wrong. One of the great tests I have of a scientific wrongness is when you have a very, very eminent scientist who's usually won a Nobel Prize. As soon as that scientist opens his or her mouth and starts talking about something that is outside their field, you can almost guarantee that they're talking cobblers. So being uncertain about things is great. Doubt is a slightly different thing. Doubt has a slight moral tinge to it. Do you doubt that climate change is happening? Well, we're not certain, so you doubt it. And I think the media is quite bad at teasing that out. All that said, I was having this discussion this morning with a friend of mine. I think the British media is actually much better. I mean, it's the worst media in the world apart from all the others. If you go and look at how climate change or how the debate about nuclear power or the debate about GM foods is covered in France or Germany or Japan or China or Russia or even the United States, our dirty, messy, corrupt, privately owned, salacious media does this far better than anyone else. So that's the last thing I'll say, and I think I'm in time.
You certainly are, Mike. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of our panellists for some really interesting contributions. Contributions which I hope have inspired some questions amongst our audience, and we've got quite a bit of time now, something like 25 minutes or so, to tackle those questions. I might actually sort of take advantage of my position of chair just to tie some thoughts together, because there was a theme I felt emerging around where is evidence useful to inform decision-making in the public, and where perhaps are things outside of evidence, moral arguments and other things, useful as well. And I think it's really important. I'm fairly sure everyone on the panel would agree, correct me if you don't, that actually one of the key things that people who are interested in the better use of evidence in public policy, what we're really asking for is where evidence applies, we should be using it well and using it transparently. And we should be honest as policymakers when we are using evidence and when we are not, and when we are doing it appropriately, as opposed to hiding behind arguments that look like they're evidence informed when actually they're ideological or other. Look, let's throw your hands up now if you've got some questions for our panellists, please. And as you ask your question, can you introduce yourself as well? Don't be shy. Brave man at the back. If you want to wait for the microphone, which I think Katie's bringing around to you. Thank you.
Hello there, I'm Jack Caswell from the British Academy. My perspective on peer review is generally from a assessment for funding point of view, but I suppose it's a broader question for even from a sort of like a science rigour point of view as well. What do the panel think about the different methods and methodologies around selection of peer reviewers, about the different how it's done by certain individuals, and about how it differs between funders or different journals and so on and so forth?
Yes, well, there's considerable scope for, let's call it judgment, on the part of the panel or the editor, for example, in my case as an editor of an academic journal, as to who we might think will do a good job at evaluating a proposal or a manuscript. And as soon as there's scope for that sort of judgment, of course, there's scope for the abuse of judgment. And actually, editors of journals have very, very powerful roles as gatekeepers to knowledge. That's something I've realised increasingly in the last few years in my particular position. And similarly with funding panels and those who serve funding panels and make decisions about who to invite to review particular proposals, they act as very powerful gatekeepers to the sort of research that will get funded. And it's back to the question that was mentioned before around, is this piece of research appropriately designed, designed in order to answer the sort of questions that it claims to be able to answer? And you'll find, and this actually is where I think that there are some important differences between the variety of disciplines. Let's not limit it just to science and social science and humanities, but if you take across the spectrum of disciplines, there are many different considerations in different disciplines about how you actually design and execute a piece of research, and what are the underlying assumptions that have been built into that research proposal. And I think that simply opens up the possibility for, and this is why, again, I think there's an idea of opening up peer review to more than just 2 or 3 experts who might be chosen, and actually having a much more engaged process for citizens or for other actors in society who have got a vested interest in the research question is a good move to make. It seems to me. It reduces the power of people like me as a gatekeeper.
There aren't many who would wish to give away the power that they have. You're on record as saying that. More questions? Should we move from the back to the lady here, and then I'll come to the gentleman? I'll take your 2 questions together.
Thank you. Chloe Selwood from NHS England. My question kind of links to some of the things that have been touched on around uncertainty and doubt and peer review, but there's been quite a lot of coverage in the media earlier in the year about evidence published in peer-reviewed journal that was quite conflicting around antivirals for influenza, and 2 very rigorous studies came out on very different views around whether they were effective or not, and different ways. They looked at the same evidence, they came out very differently. And I just wonder what the panel's views were on that, and it was played out very publicly. It was 2 quite well-known research groups, 2 well-known journals, and how that might then influence the public's behaviour, and how social scientists could look at the impact of that very publicly played out conflict and display of uncertainty in the evidence, and how social sciences could tie in with that clinical, medical, scientific aspect.
Yes, sorry, the other question.
I was planning to take the other question, but as the mic's going to take a little while. Oh, you've got one. There you go.
I can wait. Hi, Oliver Preston from the Wellcome Trust. Aileen mentioned previously about the reliance of certain areas of government and on key academics, and I guess following on from Mike's point about opening up peer review to a wider audience than those specific people, how would you balance that against, with increasing complexity in research questions, ensuring that you do have certain experts? I mean, there's very limited resources for that review in certain areas of science, the social sciences, as well as areas of biomedicine and the STEM areas.
I'll address that first question. I think when you have an apparent discrepancy between conclusions and findings, that often shows that discrepancy does reflect something that we simply don't know, that these studies have not been very conclusive. And I can think of several instances over the last 20 years, and I've been writing about science, when it seems to be the case that you have one bunch of scientists saying one thing and one equally respectable bunch of scientists saying another. And then you go and look at the papers that were published, and you realise that actually, particularly in social sciences, for example, you might be talking about very small sample sizes. You might be talking about very tenuous conclusions drawn from very little evidence. And I think the only thing that you can really say about that is, first, you don't censor it, you don't hide the debate, you don't hide the fact there's discrepancy, and you come back and look at it 10 years later and see what's sunk in. And I think the problem with an awful lot of what is reported in science, and this is, I'm not blaming scientists, but this is much the media's fault, is particularly in slack news periods like the summer, you get some fairly tenuous psychological research I can think of. And you look at the sample size, and it's sort of 13 undergraduate students in an American university, and you think, well, this isn't very representative of the population. And one of my lines was going to be that Jonathan stole from me. I loved his point that when you look at the sciences and then you go and look at things like psychology, and I think is psychology a science? You know, I think it is, but I mean, you can be rude about it. But a lot of bad science seems to come from the social sciences, particularly when you're reporting about lifestyle choices, you're reporting about crime, you're reporting about economics, and there seems to be an awful lot of debate, and I think that probably reflects what it is you're trying to study. And I think when you're looking at something like antiviral drugs, influenza, clearly it's the case that the nature of the influenza virus and how often it mutates and becomes a different virus means that it's very hard to devise a strategy that works. And that's why you will have one study finding one thing and one study finding another. And the media's job has to report that. Does that sow confusion? Yes, but that's just how it is.
I think there was a question around this issue of favourite academics versus making sure that we've got a robust way of evaluating things. Do you want to perhaps pick up on that, Aileen?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? And I think the answer probably is making sure that you're at least thinking about all shades of opinion on an issue. I mean, you may then decide when you're putting out a tender for something to only invite particular people to bid, or it may be set up in a way that only, fairly well established people can do. But I think you need to think about it. And I think the risk is, that kind of sort of sheep path to your favourite people. That's what a department has to guard itself against. And I think also a process that isn't set up in a way that acts as a barrier towards new entrants to the market, really. But yeah, it is an issue, particularly when you're thinking about something you want something to be done longitudinally over a long period of time. You're effectively excluding quite a lot of other people's. I think breakpoints and those kind of evaluations are quite helpful as well.
I mentioned about the academic peer review system being under strain, and people are invited to review way more manuscripts than they could possibly manage. I mean, there are different ways of dealing with that. One suggestion is that you would actually pay peer reviewers. I mean, currently it's done voluntarily, but you might incentivise through payment. Another suggestion, which is back to this tendency in the academy to go for performance metrics, you actually might give credits to an academic if they undertake a peer review. So at the end of the year, if they report their performance statistics to their managers in their university, they'll say, well, I've reviewed 7 peer review articles, so you get some sort of credit, not in money, but in brownie points. That's the academy, but I think my argument is to open it up more widely, and there you may need incentives, but you may not need incentives. Just providing a mechanism, a forum, a platform that makes it easy for social actors and commentators to comment on either research proposals or on manuscripts will actually, and we've certainly seen this with climate change, increasing numbers of people actually will pass comment on papers actually that have gone through peer review very often. But there are ways in which you can enlist and incentivise a larger set of actors to get them trained.
Jonathan?
Yes, in terms of the first question, when there's competing evidence, I just want to keep reinforcing this point about replication. I mean, it's until we've replicated things, there's a serious question mark. There's a US drug company, Amgen, who tried to replicate 53 landmark cancer research, like really primary core basic research around cancer, published in Nature in 2012. And they did this replication with the original researchers, because context can be really important, and they tried to do everything they could to replicate it. and only 6 of these absolute landmark studies were replicated. And these were things that were just sort of taken for granted, common knowledge. And going back to the Danny Kahneman, point about a daisy chain of replication, because he saw, quote, a train wreck coming unless we repeat these studies in a certain area of psychology. But he's absolutely right. And I'd be interested to know your views if you think that's, it's not a sexy area of research, replication. Primary research is where the money is and the excitement is, and a lot of media coverage. Attached to that, although it's different, is this issue of systematic reviews, not literature reviews. Absolutely, what do we know and what do we not know? Where are the big gaps? I think that's essential. But when's the last time you saw some media coverage about something like a big systematic review by the Cochrane? I don't know. Certainly in social science, I've seen less of it, and I think it's an important area. I think finally, also, your point about what can social science contribute to it is a really good point. It's exactly what we can do to understand how this perceptual stuff goes on. Even ethics, that we can understand some of the problems there. And I've been working with NICE, for instance, recently, who do some really interesting work about getting evidence-based or evidence-informed about public perceptions and opinions and how it changed, or how you can nudge it, or at least understand how things will play out. And there's a whole sub-discipline of that area, and I think it's vital.
Let's say something about some of the problem with science, this Economist article and others. One rather surprising fact is that since back in 1971, Richard Nixon declared the war on cancer. And since 1971, I tried to work out the figure. It's quite hard, but you put in federal spending, drug company spending, plus European, rest of the first world, bit of third world spending, you get to a figure of about $750 billion in today's money has been spent on research on cancer. And I think we can all probably agree that the results of the war on cancer have been incredibly disappointing. It has been a colossal failure. With the exception of a few endocrine cancers, breast cancer, childhood leukemia, you're basically no better off being diagnosed with some of the most common cancers than you were 50 years ago. And yet you wouldn't know that to read the journals and the reports of the journals. You'd think that there were breakthroughs every half an hour, and it simply isn't the case. And I think this replicability and lack of shows that there is a problem here. There is a problem with not reporting the null results, not saying when you found something didn't work. And there's been lots of debate about this. There's the whole cherry picking, we only report the things that seem to prove our point. Now, to take an extreme example, a few years ago, there was a flurry of papers that seemed to show that intercessory prayer worked, i.e., if people sat down and started praying for some people to get better, as opposed to others, the control group, the people who were prayed for got better faster than the ones who weren't prayed for. And this seemed to show that we lived in a completely insane universe where you had some kind of deity who would decide not to cure people on the basis they weren't being prayed for. And, of course, these publications were all American, but they were peer-reviewed. And when you looked at it a bit more carefully, as I did, it turned out there was just an enormous amount of cherry-picking going on. There'd been lots and lots of studies showing absolutely no effect. And a couple, as with anything, you can prove the sky's green if you do enough studies. So there's that effect. I'm a little bit concerned the idea that peer review is completely opened up. What is to stop the Tin Hat Brigade coming out in force? I know there is this debate about peer review and it should be completely open. But then how do we control what we've got now, which is that peer review seems to have its problems too. It can be corrupt, it can be corrupting, it can be very slow, and it can be ineffective. And just bear in mind that war on cancer. Whatever you believe, whenever you listen to the health reports on the BBC or read in the Daily Mail or the Guardian, it is a war humans have lost. If NASA had spent $1 trillion trying to get to the moon, and they'd only got as far as the top of Mount Everest, we would say they hadn't succeeded. That's where we got with the war on cancer. But you would not know that to read the journals.
I am keen to bring in at least one more round of questions. I would say on the point of knowing what has been done and knowing what is published and what is reported, it's particularly in medical sciences. I'm sure people in the room are aware of Sense About Science's All Trials campaign, which is absolutely pressing for the publication of every study that is done on...
Every single one needs to be published.
Absolutely, because otherwise we're working on partial information. And there's no reason why that principle shouldn't apply, of course, to social science research, although it's a far more complicated issue there. We've got a question here and then one at the back as well.
Thank you very much for the lively debate. I'm Daniela Duca from GISC, and I sort of have a thought, obviously not fully formed, but a lot of papers, when they cite other papers, they do review them to some extent, so they do take a stand, especially, I would say, in social sciences. So what are your thoughts around, I don't know, blending some of those citations into into qualifying them as reviews, in some ways?
It's an interesting question. There's one at the back as well.
Hi, Sophie Dupont from the Royal Hospital for Neurodisability. My question was about the repeatability of research. As we all know, it's really great if we can repeat some of these results, but no funders will ever fund that type of studies because you need to have innovation and innovative and something new in your title if you want to get any funding. And then if you find that actually the study was perfectly fine in the first place, you find exactly the same findings, you can't publish it. Or no one will accept that because, again, you need to be innovative, it needs to be new, you need to add something to science. You're not adding anything. Actually, you add something, but not something new. So I think there seems to be very little value in doing those studies. The only study you're going to go is someone who look at a very high-profile paper in Science or Nature and think there is something slightly dodgy in it. And they will immediately try to repeat it to actually put it down. But not to actually say, great, they were right, let's publish, they were right.
I just to comment on the first question there about academics who may cite or review other articles in their own manuscript. That though is a very, very selective process, and what we tend to find is that academics will either cite other studies very, very deliberately because it supports their presuppositions, or because the results or the argument that they're making in their paper is directly contradicting. So I don't think you can take that simply as a way of conducting review, because it itself is going to be significantly biased or slanted. And I just want to also just come back on this thing about open peer review. You're cautious about how open you make open review. It depends what you think the purpose of open review, open peer review is. If you think it's to somehow root, well, there are a number of different values for doing it. One is maybe to root out errors or misapplied techniques that have been missed by the so-called experts. That's fine. I'm actually rather more interested, though, in the idea of open review enhancing the public credibility of knowledge. In other words, the fact that this has been subject to an open peer review process, whether it's found errors or whether the Tin Hat Brigade have come in and written 1,000 comments or not, is actually not the point. The point is that an open review process means that knowledge then actually has greater credibility and therefore greater potential utility in public life. It's the idea of public knowledge rather than private accredited knowledge.
The very good point made by the lady at the back about how do we fund effectively replication, how do we fund the publication of negative findings. I mean, there seems to be maybe Sense About Science can offer a view here, there seems to be a hole there in how science is funded, whether it's from journals wanting sexy papers, whether it's academies wanting to fund innovative research. As you say, there's no money in going and doing someone else's experiment again. And it tends to be the rather glamorous left field findings that are published in Science and Nature that somebody tries to replicate because they think they can make a reputation for themselves, proving somebody grand wrong. And there was a very good example of this about 3 or 4 years ago when Science published a paper that showed that a group of scientists working out in California had found a microbe living in a lake that appeared to be using arsenic in the place of, I think, potassium in its biochemistry. And I actually know a couple of people involved with that study. And it looks like it was probably wrong. What was extraordinary was people piled in. They didn't like this young team with a physicist, Paul Davis had his name on it, saying these things. It's published in Science. This is outrageous. So they piled in. They picked the paper to bits, which is fair enough. That is how science should work. However, going back to cancer, nobody picks apart those thousands and thousands of studies that are published every year showing this cancer drug is wonderful. They're all just equally wrong. But there's no kudos in destroying that bad science. So there needs to be, I think, maybe an argument for bodies, something analogous maybe to the Cochrane Review, something like that, to look at the quality of findings, to fund replication, to fund looking back at some of these things, particularly in biomedical research, which seems to be, its feet are not on solid rock, I think, a lot of the time, and review this evidence. And there doesn't seem to be a body that does that at the moment. Would you agree?
I think you're right.
It's ad hoc. It's not. There's no.
I think that's exactly the point I was going to make. It's very patchy. It does depend on the discipline, but it is at best patchy. Would be my take on it. And there certainly isn't a body that takes responsibility for it. Something to pick up. Possibly over drinks. I'll mention that again at the end. Never miss an opportunity to mention drinks. But I do want to bring Aileen back in because I was unfair to her earlier. Not giving you a chance to come.
Happens a lot to the NEO, but we get used to it. I just want to pick up that point about replication as well, and also tie in with the point about very small numbers, because you tend to get it a lot in the justice field. Actually, you tend to find something being published or being put forward, and you actually look at it, it's maybe like 6 offenders in a trial or whatever. And I think one of the best things that the Ministry of Justice did recently was it set up the data hub, so that even very small bits of work, you send your numbers in there. They would get their statisticians to look at it properly and then tell you whether you had made any difference to those people in terms of reducing their reoffending against different measures, and also whether you weren't doing any good at all. And it actually provided an opportunity for charities in particular in the third sector to be able to get some sort of underpinning to the work that they do, rather than just the usual, which is people go, oh, that's very nice, and if it fits in with what they think already, they'll try and scale it up massively, which I think there's a big risk to public funds there. That's what I was going to say.
No, it's an interesting point you make. It's an issue, criminal justice, that Sense About Science is very much interested in now. We will shortly be publishing a guide that helps make sense of evidence and how it relates to crime policies, an area where really the overwhelming majority of research is quite shoddy, not least on the basis of small sample size and of political bias as well. I'm looking around the room as to ask whether we've got time for one last quick round of questions. You're going to have to be really quick. Alex, I'll come to you last. I want to come to the ladies here first.
Thank you. It's as much to make comments as to ask questions. I'm Linda Entree, and I chair the International Advisory Group of the Academy of Social Sciences, and I'm particularly interested in the international dimensions of evidence-based policy, and we've run a series of seminars on that very topic. But there are lots of issues which have been raised, and I'll just try very quickly to pull them together a little bit.
If you would be brief, it would be great.
I'll try. Just the distinction between science, social science, and humanities, I think, is a very false distinction when you're looking at evidence bases, because I'm very much an advocate of mixed methods, interdisciplinary, international methods, and almost inevitably, when you're doing something international, it does become interdisciplinary at the same time, because you're coming from different perspectives. And what is called social science in one country might be humanities in another country. So, that ends up being a rather false distinction. But what we have been trying to do is to work on hierarchies of evidence, which sorts of evidence carry most weight in different situations. And I can suggest a lot of publications and outcomes from that. But I also attended today an event by Post that Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. And I have to say that the way that they collect or review evidence and present it to parliamentarians is, I think, one of the most unbiased ways that I've seen. So, and the sorts of topics that they're working on, I think it's absolutely excellent. And there's some very good examples.
Thank you very much. The lady just behind you there.
Hi, my name's Amelia Sharman from LSE. Drawing on this idea of replicability, lots of social science isn't replicable because of the methods that's used, and it's really interesting listening to the language that was used by the panel was things like experiment and statistics and null results and things, and knowledge that isn't based on those types of replicable methods, is that less legitimate? Can you only base decisions on things that fit that model? I'd be really interested, particularly Jonathan, in your view on that.
And Alex.
Hi, Alex Thompson from Sense About Science. My question's kind of slightly off topic from all the other questions. It was more to get the panel's opinion as to why politicians don't seem to be willing to engage with evidence when they create policy. Is that because of the type of people who tend to go into politics, or because it's easier, or because they're bowing to political pressure?
There's a simple answer to that, and it's all of those things. It's not as bad as we think, actually. I have dealings with politicians at several levels and have done over the years, and actually most ministers I've met are quite willing to engage with evidence. There are vast armies of civil servants in every government department that will do their Sir Humphrey-ish best to possibly keep evidence away from them. But there are, as I said, there are other issues to consider. We live in a democracy. Public perception is quite important. I think when it comes to things like punishing offenders, there is a lack of evidence about what works. And I think it's very interesting to look at different penal systems and see which has a better reoffending rate or worse reoffending rate than others. I think with drug legalization, it's very useful that we have a nation state, the United States, where a number of states have decided to take a very different line on drugs to others, and we can actually come back 10, 15, 20 years at a time and say, what has been the effect? Has drug taking gone up in Colorado? Has it gone down? Has crime gone up? Has crime gone down? Has the tax take from legalizing marijuana, has that helped the state? And we can actually start having some evidence-based policy. But I don't think it's that bad. I think most intelligent... There are some absolute dullards out there. There are people who basically are as dim as cheese who go into politics, but most of them aren't. Most of them are quite well-meaning men and women who do want to do the right thing, and they will try and use evidence. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're using the right evidence, but that's possibly the issue, is what evidence finds its way into the hands of the politicians, not the politician stroking the white cat and deciding they're going to ignore all the evidence that disagrees with them.
Dim as cheese. That's a hashtag. I'm going to do something slightly strange. I'm going to take one more question before I ask the panellists to sum up any answers they've got to the questions that we've just in that round, because we have already run out of time. But this is an interesting discussion we want to make the most of. One last question.
With regards to negative findings, should we be conducting peer review sooner? So conducting peer review before the results are in to try and remove bias against negative findings that way, as is being tried by eLife with the reproducibility project. So it's where journals give a commitment to publish based on the soundness of an idea and the soundness of the methods proposed, rather than the significance or otherwise of the results when they come in.
So we've got comments around when does peer review actually play a role. We've got comments around the replicability or otherwise of social science, and on how the humanities and social sciences perhaps shouldn't be, and science shouldn't be so tightly distinguished. 20, 30 seconds on any of these that you wish to pick up on as we wind up. Mike, you first, perhaps?
I'll just pick up on this thing about different disciplines. I wasn't trying to make fixed distinctions between these three meta domains, but I do think there are differences in how knowledge in these different domains gets accredited and validated, and how it circulates in public life. And I'm quite happy for us to think about different types of evidence suited for different types of problems, but I would rather talk about a palette of evidence than a hierarchy. We've got into problems with hierarchies for example, about climate change that I would want to challenge. So I would like to think about palettes of evidence, for example.
Hierarchies, Jonathan.
Yeah, I just want to stress appropriateness. Really, I'm also a big fan of mixed methods, and it's not just humanities, by the way. It's the arts. I think there's some really interesting research in the arts, things like design, or even like things like around storytelling about how to communicate things on climate change, for instance, where it's really valuable. But there's a whole area of qualitative research where I think is vital, but it's going to be part of the palette. Yeah, I'm going to use that, I think. I like that phrase. That isn't replicable, but it's still a really important part of it. I've seen some amazing stuff, for instance, on ethnographic research, designing new public services, that was really important. Very local, using design thinking and ethnographic thinking. We need the whole gamut, but it's got to be appropriate to what you're looking at. You know, let's not start with a method first.
I just would add there about the fact that the answer to a complex problem is never binary, but the debate, particularly political debate, tends to become, is it this answer, is it that answer? And it's usually a mixture of all of them. And the thing that's really important is to think all the time about causality between the thing that you're investing money in and the outcome you want to see. If we got more of that right, we'd get more value for our money.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think that it now falls to me to draw what's been a really interesting discussion to a close. A discussion, though, that draw this part of it to a close. We can continue through over drinks in the room across the hall, I think it is. Before we move over to have a drink, I would like to thank very much the ESRC for us being part of this festival. It's been really interesting being here. I'd really like to thank Sage as well for partnering us on this event. I think it's been really interesting working with you guys on it. I particularly want to thank, by the way, Katie and Victoria from our side of things, who have helped put this event together. Thank you guys. Thank you everybody for coming and making this question and answer session that followed the panel discussion so interesting. And of course, thank you very much to our panel for some fantastic contributions. Enjoy the rest of your evening.